Welcome to Stars and Swords. I'm Alistair Stevens. This week we continue our discussion of William Gibson's 1984 cyberpunk classic, Neuromancer, with the 5 chapters which constitute together part 2 of the book, The Shopping Trip, in which we build our team, we bounce around the world a little bit, we introduce arguably the most interesting character in the entire book. Well, second only to Molly Millions, I'm sure, the character of Wintermute, which is enigmatic at this point in the story, and we're going to talk a lot about identity, and we're going to talk a lot about the mind-body problem, the most recurring theme here as we discuss Neuromancer, and we're going to talk a little about our biases moving through this book, both implicit and explicit, and when I say our biases, I mean, of course, those of William Gibson. There's a lot to discuss as we get through tonight's reading. A quick word of warning right up front. Because of some scheduling mishaps last week over the Thanksgiving break, I have been forced, not unwillingly, I have to say, to collapse what was supposed to be a 5-week season looking at Neuromancer into a 4-week season. I'll have some more details on this right at the end of the show, but the short version of it is that next week we're going to cover part 3, and then the following week in a extra length episode we are going to cover the entirety of the back half of the novel. That should get us exactly where we want to be in order to begin our discussion of C.S. Lewis's The Voyage of the Dawn Treader in the break between Christmas and New Year, just to give us a little light, a little spark of something right there at the end of the year. Thank you so much for joining me tonight. We've got Brian here and we've got Hugh joining us. It's going to be a really fun discussion tonight, guys. I hope that you are ready. We begin, of course, moving into chapter 3 with our transition away from Japan back to what is, at least to Case, home. We're going to take a look at the sprawl. Home. Home was Bama, the sprawl, the Boston-Atlanta metropolitan axis. Program a map to display frequency of data exchange. Every 1,000 megabytes, a single pixel on a very large screen. Manhattan and Atlanta burn solid white. Then they start to pulse, the rate of traffic threatening to overload your simulation. Your map is about to go nova. Cool it down, up your scale. Each pixel, 1,000,000 megabytes. At 100 million megabytes per second, you begin to make out certain blocks in Midtown Manhattan, outlines of 100-year-old industrial parks ringing the old core of Atlanta. Two immediately striking things here, I think, with this approach, the visualization here of the sprawl. The first, again, we are playing with cityscapes and the Matrix, the construct of cyberspace that Case is still, of course, so preoccupied with, obsessed with, probably would not be overstating it too much. But what we're also doing here is creating a tension, or observing a tension, I suppose, that is a very millennial tension. This is one of the things that Gibson gets a great deal of credit for, deservedly, in this instance. And it's recognizing the transition from the industrial future to the post-industrial data-driven future. Information is the way that we track, well, here, as we present this imaginary map of the sprawl, information, data exchange is the way that we track significance. It's how we monitor importance. It's the Boston-Atlanta metropolitan axis, and it is Manhattan, and it is Atlanta. These are the points on this imaginary map, which, as it says, burns solid white, even processing a huge amount, every 1,000 megabytes, right? An unthinkable amount of data in the early 1980s is now insignificant. It is insufficient. We keep upgrading our resolution here in order to get not just a sense of how data is moving through this gigantic conurbation, but also how it is physically situated. Even here, Gibson is reminding us that you don't escape fully into cyberspace. No one can escape fully into cyberspace. There is still a physical footprint left behind. There is still physical infrastructure, right? It is, of course, ironic now, reading this book in 2025, as we're facing the construction of ferociously consumptive data centers all over the world in order to power our fractional, AI future, such as it is. Wow, have I just date stamped this podcast? I fear that I have. Yes, there was a moment when it seemed as though AI was going to be the future, whether we wanted it or not. I'm sure if you're listening to this in 6 months, things will look very different and arguably much more grim. So even here, as I say, we're looking at certain blocks in Midtown Manhattan, outlines of 100-year-old industrial parks ringing the old core of Atlanta. This is not going to be the last time that we talk about a post-industrial landscape in this week's reading, but it is the first time that we're going to acknowledge that the footprint of our digital selves, even in Gibson's sense of the cyberpunk future, is anchored in the remnant, the ruin, the remain of our old industrial selves. We're going to see that a little more clearly as we move on, in fact, from the sprawl in very short order. So we get Case waking up, right? We also get, through the fact that he is waking, we're getting the idea that this data visualization of the sprawl may well be part of his dream, may well be part of his vision of the Matrix. It's been denied him for so long. His obsession is now particularly acute. The narrative tells us, though, that he was, in fact, dreaming of airports and dreaming of Molly. Speaking of whom, Molly gets Case a present, a shuriken, a little throwing star, misinterpreting his interest in them. He, as we've known from the first reading that we covered in our last episode, he stares at them hanging in the shop windows, but what he is seeing is not something that he wants. What he's seeing are these symbols of stars, the constellations which define Case's fate, and Molly misinterpreting that connection that Case experiences, but folding herself into the metaphor really beautifully, buys one for him. He is now holding a gift from Molly Millions, one of the stars that defines his future, or that gives us a sense of what is possible. And then we get into the terms of Case's employment. Let's advance our slide here. Armitage closed the door and crossed the room to stand in front of Case. "You're a lucky boy, Case. You should thank me." "Should I?" Case blew noisily on his coffee. "You needed a new pancreas. The one we bought you frees you from a dangerous dependency." "Thanks, but I was enjoying the dependency." "Good, because you've got a new one." "How's that?" Case looked up from his coffee. Armitage was smiling. "You have 15 toxin sacs bonded to the lining of various main arteries, Case. They're dissolving. Very slowly, but they definitely are dissolving. Each one contains a mycotoxin. You're already familiar with the effects of that mycotoxin. It was the one your former employers gave you in Memphis." Case blinked up at the smiling mask. "You have time to do what I'm hiring you for, Case, but that's all. Do the job, and I can inject you with an enzyme that will dissolve the bond without opening the sacs. Then you'll need a blood change. Otherwise, the sacs melt, and you're back where I found you. So you see, Case, you need us. You need us as badly as you did when we scraped you up from the gutter." The carrot and the stick, the handshake and the gun. Armitage here securing Case's obedience by giving him the one thing that he wanted more than anything, a return to cyberspace, and then threatening that that thing will once again be taken away, and that the means of that removal are already in place, right? These mycotoxin sacs embedded into 15 of Case's arterial pathways. It's an interesting positioning of Armitage. It's not perhaps surprising, right? And I would say that its intent is not to be surprising. We're still here, for all that we've left behind Chiba City, for all that we've left behind our cast of characters to whom we are initially introduced, we're still here very much, I think, in the hard-boiled, pulpy noir detective story. And this is not an unusual bit of plot arrangement here. This is not an unusual relationship for our, plucky, resilient, but still very, on his back on his heels kind of protagonist to engage with a figure of authority. Then the nature of that authority turns out to be very interesting. The positioning of Armitage is stronger than this scene would imply, but there is something about the exact mechanism, the means by which the story is being presented, right? It is almost too neat. It is almost too perfect because, for reasons which we will discover in the course of this week's reading, Armitage himself is too neat. Armitage himself is too perfect. He is playing a storybook role. Well, storybook is maybe the wrong way of putting that, right? There's no fairy tale aspect here. He is playing the authority figure in a dime store paperback because he has been built to be the authority figure in a dime store paperback. More on that as we get ahead. Brian's here observing in the chat, "I wonder how much inspiration Ernest Cline got from his Ready Player One oasis from Neuromancer's Matrix." It's so difficult to be certain, given Cline's preoccupation with the pop culture of the 1980s, which is, of course, the basis. It is the bedrock of Ready Player One. I would imagine that he's extremely familiar with the cyberpunk movement. He's extremely familiar with the work of William Gibson. It seems as though you don't get to be Ernest Cline unless you are familiar with the work of Gibson. But what we also have to acknowledge is the enormous influence that Gibson has, both fictionally and literally, right? Both digitally and IRL. His conception of the Matrix becomes an operative functional metaphor for our understanding of the internet as we're moving through the late 1980s, right? As you're coming into the era of graphical interfaces, we are leaning on the kinds of interfaces devised in text by writers like Gibson to kind of conceptualize our approach. I find that very interesting, and I find Gibson's particular approach to that. You know, we're going to have better opportunities to talk about this when we really connect to cyberspace and see exactly how Case experiences it. But yeah, Brian, I think you're suggesting your suggestive question is probably very well founded. My guess would be that Klein is extremely familiar with this. Ready Player One. It's such a complicated book. It's such a complicated set of ideas. It is such a complicated proposition, particularly as someone who cares about stories and wants to pull them apart and see how they operate. It is extremely deft and sophisticated in some ways, and absolutely blind to its own inference and conclusion in other ways. And I just find that so fascinating. If you take that book harmlessly, then I think it's extremely enjoyable and I think it's very good. But if you take that book seriously, it presents insurmountable problems about, you know, the toxicity of nostalgia and really failing to grapple with exactly what Gibson is laying out here, right? The other big divide that we see in Ready Player One as Klein explores it is the mind-body duality, right? It is this mind-body problem. Are you your body, or are you the being that you project into this digital space? Like where do we find the locus of control? And Ready Player One kind of fails to interrogate that very sufficiently, and certainly doesn't give it the nuance that Gibson does. More on that in the slides to come. Let's see here as we move past. Was there anything else in the slide that I wanted to pull out? There, in fact, it wasn't. So we get the beat with, except, yes, so we have the threat against Case. The clock is ticking. Case and Molly go into Manhattan after assembling the new equipment that Armitage has delivered. They are now provisioned. They get scanned by the Finn, and who can't confirm the mycotoxin pouches within Case's body. Molly tells Case that Armitage is suspect and that he should definitely look into that, which he will. And he learns at this point that he's going to be working with a construct, a digitized version of the deceased Dixie Flatline, also known as McCoy Polly. Here, by the way, Gibson just embarrassing himself with how good his names are. Just a rush of fantastic names. McCoy Polly, also known as Dixie Flatline. All they have to do is get into SenseNet, the company that paid Dix for his construct, and retrieve it. So, firstly, we're going to get this little mini heist, right? We're going to get this experimental kind of feeling out of our team dynamics. We're going to see exactly how they work. But even here, we are very carefully raising these questions of identity, exactly as I was just discussing, because we have the construct. We have the Dix construct, which, is a construct, right? It is a recording of his personality. It does not believe that it is alive. It doesn't believe that it is the real, McCoy Polly. It believes that it is a construct that was created from fragments of that personality, fragments of that being. But of course, that puts it in an interesting position vis-a-vis our ongoing discussion of the mind-body problem. Is this thing that is not entirely real still conscious? Is it still sapient? Is it still capable of thought? Is it capable of self-expression? Or is it simply an input-output algorithm? Is it simply a record of what Dixie Flatline, of what McCoy Polly would have done under certain circumstances? Is it generative, to use an extremely loaded word here in 2025? And that's not the extent of our challenging questions with regard to the construct itself, because it is also, of course, physical hardware. They have to go physically, Molly has to go physically into SenseNet in order to recover the actual hardware that carries the construct. So even this artificial being, right, this artificial construct, even that isn't freed from the tyranny of matter, the tyranny of the flesh. It is still tied back to the physical world in a way that is still inescapable. And obviously, when we consider the positioning of the physical aspect of Dix's construct material, right? When we're thinking about the object itself that is going to be recovered, the fact that it is kept in a vault is extremely striking. We'll get to that. Before we get to that, though, I want to introduce something that's really jumped out at me during this reading of Neuromancer, and it is, I think, a major theme that I have in my way kind of overlooked every time that I've read this book before, and I'm thrilled to get into it as we're moving forward. This is Case asking Molly a challenging question to see what motivates her. So what's Armitage got dissolving inside you? I'm an easy make. She smiled. Anybody any good at what they do, that's what they are, right? You got a jack, I got a tussle. He stared at her. So tell me what you know about Armitage. For starters, nobody named Armitage took part in any screaming fist. I checked. But that doesn't mean much. He doesn't look like any of the pics of the guys who got out. She shrugged. Big deal. And starters is all I got. She drummed her nails on the back of the chair. But you're a cowboy, aren't you? I mean, maybe you can have a little look around. She smiled. He'd kill me. Maybe. Maybe not. I think he needs you, Case, and real bad. Besides, you're a clever John. No, you can winkle him, sure. What else is on the list that you mentioned? Toys. Mostly for you. And one certified psychopath named Peter Riviera. Real ugly customer. We'll get to Riviera in just a little while. Before we get to that, though, I want to consider this thesis of Molly Millions right here, right? She doesn't need mycotoxin pouches dissolving in her bloodstream. She doesn't need for Armitage to put anything inside her because she understands almost elementally her own motivation. She understands who she is and what, therefore, she does. I'm an easy make, she says. Anybody any good at what they do, that's what they are, right? You got a jack, I got a tussle. You are, Case, a console cowboy. That is what made the application of the mycotoxin in the first place, the consequences of the mycotoxin in the first place, so destructive to you because you could no longer do the thing that is the thing that you do, right? We're approaching a kind of Aristotelian perspective on being and on purpose and on virtue here. We are what we repeatedly do, right? Well, here's Molly increasing that, inflating that, escalating that to the point of almost presenting like a role-playing game class system. Right? She is a tussler. She is a bruiser. She is a fighter. And Case is going to be over here running the deck and charting the matrix. So all of this, I want to kind of establish this. So this is a post-it note right here in our book, just reminding us to consider how we approach these questions of being and doing with particular regard to agency. We'll get to that in just a little while. I'm setting up a lot in a Gibsonian twist tonight. What I'm doing here at the beginning is setting up a lot that I'm going to return to and explain more fully in the pages to come. This is the point in the book where Case jacks into the matrix for the first time since the procedure. We get this quote that I think has been repeated many places all over the internet, right? And somewhere he was laughing in a white painted loft, distant figures caressing the deck, tears of release streaking his face. We get this rather complex idea that he is both present and not present, that he is both present and absent, present and distant, that somewhere he is laughing. He is having this physiological, biological response, the laughter, the tears, the fingers on the plastic of the deck itself, but he himself is not there because he himself is here in the Matrix. And then the Finn shows up to tighten security on the room to foreshadow the idea that Case will be sharing Molly's sensorium, which is, of course, where we begin with Chapter 4, slipping into Molly's awareness as a passenger, right? Case playing the role of witness to her experience of the world. We'll have more to say about SimStim as we move forward through the book. Gibson deliberately establishes it early so that he can return to it and explore some of its applications, I suppose would be the right way to put it. Though it is vital right from the jump to see, as it's presented to us, I think, this processing, this parceling, this commodification of the sense experience of the real-life human being as a significant part of Gibson's world building, right? We're here, again, another swing from another angle at the mind-body problem. It's still very much a problem, particularly as we separate further the flesh from the spirit, whether we're talking about Case in cyberspace or inside of Molly's own experience, Molly's sensorium. And this inspires us to ask, I think, that if Case's experience of Molly's sensorium is unlike Case's experience of his own sensorium, which it is, right? He's aware of the feel of her body. He's aware of the movement of her body and how it differs from his own. But at no point does he believe that he is occupying Molly's body in any kind of real way, right? He is experiencing it, but it is a passive experience. He's not engaged in the same way. He would never confuse Molly's sensorium for his own or the sensorium of any other person into whose body we might digitally slip. And if we do see this distinction that Molly's body, for all that the feeling of it is as immediate, as realized, as complex, as sophisticated as Case's experience of his own body, and we might be speculating a little bit there, but let's acknowledge that they're at least in the same ballpark. then we have to wonder, I think, where the distinction comes from. What is the difference between Case's experience of his own body, his own flesh, and Molly's? And the answer, of course, is agency. It is control. It is the ability to act and to choose how one acts. Case has that when he's in his own body, to a certain degree, though obviously, we're talking about his dependence on pharmaceutical assistance. We're talking about these traitorous little sacks that have been placed inside of his bloodstream. So the body is not completely within our control. The body, which is one of the interesting kind of arguments that falls out of debates surrounding the mind-body problem, this idea of dualism, is that the body is real and material and flesh, but it is also unknowable. That doesn't make it transparent to our sense of understanding. We cannot understand how, our own internal materials work at any given moment. We have this life raft in a roiling sea of experience that we can really chart, that we can really recognize, right? Oh, I know what this emotion is. Oh, I'm feeling this certain way. That probably means X, Y, and Z, a pattern that we learn through long years of experience. So that's one of the interesting kind of ways in which we're positioning the mind and the body. It's not a simple divergence. It's a more complicated way of exploring both. But anchoring that here in action is fascinating, particularly in the light of our previous slide, right? If Molly is right and we are what we do, like fundamentally we are what we do, then that puts the weight of being, the weight of identity, the weight of purpose, certainly, and ultimately the weight of morality onto our actions. It puts our locus of being right up against the point at which we interface with the world, right? It is the taking of action that makes us us, and the actions that we take define what kind of us we are. And that, I think, is a really valuable thing to hold on to as we move forward, as we consider the ways in which people maintain control over themselves, voluntarily surrender control over themselves, and have that control taken from them. More on that in just a moment. This is also the point at which we introduce the Panther Moderns, our street gang with an inclination toward performative and destructive acts, destructive pranks, which ultimately, of course, manifest as and always border on acts of domestic terrorism, and also extreme surgery. Let's take a look at our next slide as we consider the challenge of Angelo. Case met his first modern 2 days after he'd screened the Hosaka's Case met his first modern 2 days after he'd screened the Hosaka's Précis. The moderns, he decided, were a contemporary version of the big scientists of his own late teens. There was a kind of ghostly teenage DNA at work in the sprawl, something that carried the coded precepts of various short-lived subcults and replicated them at odd intervals. The Panther Moderns were a soft-head variant on the scientists. If the technology had been available, the big scientists would all have had sockets stuffed with Microsofts. It was the style that mattered, and the style was the same. The moderns were mercenaries, practical jokers, nihilistic techno-fetishists. The one who showed up at the loft door with a box of diskettes from the Finn was a soft-voiced boy named Angelo. His face was a simple graft grown on collagen and shark cartilage polysaccharides, smooth and hideous. It was one of the nastiest pieces of elective surgery Case had ever seen. When Angelo smiled, revealing the razor-sharp canines of some large animal, Case was actually relieved. Toothbud transplants. He'd seen that before. You can't let the little pricks generation gap you, Molly said. Case nodded, absorbed in the patterns of the SenseNet ice. So Gibson's theory here of rebellion, and if, as I mentioned in last week's session, it can be hard to track always and to track consistently the punk in cyberpunk, here we have a perspective, though it is by no means a flattering perspective, right? Gibson here is presenting the idea that the aesthetics of rebellion are few and are insubstantial and recur. They just roll through the traditions. The big scientists back when Case was growing up, right, of his own late teens, by the way, so we're talking less than a decade here, right, because he's in his early 20s. So the big scientists, we don't really know anything about them, but they were apparently very fashionable in the sprawl at that time. They would have, if the technology was available, we're told, heads loaded with Microsofts, just like all of this additional material in their brains. And, you know, these guys, the Panther Moderns, they are different, but it's the same kind of aesthetic. The aesthetic recurs. Mercenaries, practical jokers, nihilistic techno-fetishists. But how this thing manifests is very different. We have this grafted face grown on collagen and shark cartilage polysaccharides, smooth and hideous, right? Just this horrible kind of transformative abuse, if we can use that word, though I'm sure the Panther Moderns themselves would use, you know, words like art, would use words like creation and crafting. But what Case sees is something that is just unbearably hideous until Angelo opens his mouth and reveals something that is, to us at least, much more directly hideous, right? I find it difficult to picture exactly what it is that Angelo looks like, but the smile, the razor-sharp canines of some large animal, and Case were like, oh, okay, tooth buds. We've been doing that for years. This I recognize. And Molly, in one of the lines of the book here, you can't let the little pricks generation gap you, Molly said. You cannot let youth culture, if you want to remain relevant, if you want to remain in the world, if you want to be capable of taking action, if you want to remain possessed of your own agency in this world, then you cannot let the purpose of these teen rebels be effective. You cannot allow them to, through the transformations of their bodies, of their cultures, of their language, right? This is happening all the time. This is happening right now. It has been happening for as long as we have had children, and it will continue to happen for as long as we have children. One of the reasons that children form, adolescents, right, teens here, one of the reasons that they form these very specific identity frameworks, right? One of the reasons that they form these groups associated with very specific aesthetic or ideological standards is that they want to create this generation gap. They want to create space between themselves and their parents. They want to claim for themselves this active identity, right? Subcultures in general will try to isolate themselves, particularly elite subcultures which believe that they are superior, right? Whether the other example of this that is extremely common is that any isolated, professional or technical group, any group of people with the same skills will develop their own jargon. And one of the reasons that these groups develop their own jargon is that they can communicate more quickly, more efficiently, more directly. They all share this common culture, and so they can embody that. They can encode that into language, right? But the other reason that these groups develop their own jargon, develop their own lingo, develop their own language is that it isolates them, is that it makes it harder for others to infiltrate their culture, their community, right? As I've said before on the show many times, the first purpose of any culture, of even teenage fashion subcultures, is to protect its own existence, right? That is the first thing that cultures do. They will always try and define themselves in terms of who they are and, crucially, who they are not. So what we see here from Gibson, I think, is a pretty direct kind of reinterpretation of what is happening in punk culture in the early 1980s, right? He's kind of seen the rise and fall of hippie culture through the late 60s into the 70s, and then punk culture through the 70s into the 80s, and just recognizing that there are cycles. There's a limited basket of things that you can do to rebel in the world, and we're just going to keep recycling them. And when they fall out of fashion, they'll just come back in a new way with a new, shark-faced cartilage graft on your, I don't know, it's terrible. It's just terrible. From there, though, right? Let's pick up the pace here as we crash into this first heist, this kind of this trial run heist to kind of set the stakes of the book, and also to, directly in terms of the plot, to get the flatline construct, but also to kind of road test the ideas that Gibson is working with. How does this work when the rubber hits the road? And it works rather beautifully, in fact. Let's move on to our next slide. So we see here a classic cyberpunk raid, right? We see a run. I can't believe it's taken me this long to mention the Shadowrun role-playing game, of course, which is what if cyberpunk, but also elves and orcs. And the idea there of the run is that this is the kind of mission that in a cyberpunk world you would execute. We have Molly there in person, we have Case there in cyberspace, and we have the Panther Moderns providing this social distraction in the form of domestic terrorism, right? Not to in any way excuse the excesses of the Panther Moderns here. But what they are doing is a kind of very direct social engineering. And these are kind of the three pillars, if you like, of mission-based storytelling in a cyberpunk environment. You have the physical, the brutal, the violent. Then you have the digital, you have the Matrix, you have cyberspace. And then you also have this aspect of social engineering. You have this aspect of considering the system and its circumstances as a whole in order to break it apart. That's peculiarly common in cyberpunk stories when contrasted with other heists, right? Let's get into this description then of panic. Case had seen panic before, but never in an enclosed area. The SenseNet employees spilling out of the elevators had surged for the street doors only to meet the foam barricades of the tacticals and the sandbag guns of the Bama Rapids. The two agencies, convinced that they were containing a horde of potential killers, were cooperating with an uncharacteristic degree of efficiency. Beyond the shattered wreckage of the main street doors, bodies were piled 3 deep on the barricades. The hollow thumping of the riot guns provided a constant background for the sound the crowd made as it surged back and forth across the lobby's marble floor. Case had never heard anything like that sound. Neither, apparently, had Molly. Jesus, she said, and hesitated. It was a sort of keening, rising into a bubbling wail of raw and total fear. The lobby floor was covered with bodies, clothing, blood, and long trampled scrolls of yellow printout. Come on, sisters, we're for out. Excuse me. Come on, sister, we're for out. The eyes of the two moderns stared at madly swirling shades of polycarbon, their suits unable to keep up with the confusion of shape and color that raged behind them. You hurt? Come on, Tommy will walk you. Tommy handed something to the one who spoke, a video camera wrapped in polycarbon. Chicago, she said. I'm on my way. And then she was falling, not to the marble floor slick with blood and vomit, but down some blood-warm well into silence and the dark. Gibson here showing that he is not afraid to demonstrate the inevitable conclusion of these campaigns against structure and society. That when one rebels, particularly when one is well armed in an act of rebellion, there is a consequence. There is a fallout. The fallout here being the brutal suppression of the SenseNet employees by symbols of authority, right? By the tacticals and the Bama Rapids, as we learn here. In the aftermath of all of this, we meet the, again, brilliantly named Lupus Yonderboy, the leader of the Panther Moderns, who, after taking his payment from Armitage, passes a message to Case, the word Wintermute. And as we begin Chapter 5, Case tells Molly, who takes it to the Finn, who immediately identifies Wintermute as a Turing-registered artificial intelligence belonging to Tessier Ashpool S.A. We get the story here of Jimmy the Thief, who steals this curious artifact, this elaborately constructed artificial head made by Tessier Ashpool S.A. He passes it on to his fence, Smith, who, as all fences do, I guess, engages in some really high level art sales. And Smith is then visited by the assassin, the ninja assassin, the vat-grown ninja assassin, indeed, who cordially and calmly, politely pays a finder's fee to Smith and then later kills Jimmy for stealing the artifact in the first place. And this, in fact, I added an extra slide here because this is where we learn about the Villa Straylight, where the concluding action of the story will take place. Freeside, the Finn said. The spindle. Turns out they own damn near the whole thing. The interesting stuff was the picture we got when the cowboy ran a regular go-to on the news morgues and compiled a précis. Family organization, corporate structure, supposedly you can buy into an essay, but there hasn't been a share of Tessier Ashpool traded on the open market in over 100 years. On any market, as far as I know. You're looking at a very quiet, very eccentric, first-generation, high-orbit family, run like a corporation. Big money, very shy of media, a lot of cloning. Orbital law's a lot softer on genetic engineering, right? And it's hard to keep track of which generation or combination of generations is running the show at a given time. How's that? Molly asked. Got their own cryogenic setup. Even under orbital law, you're legally dead for the duration of a freeze. Looks like they trade off, though nobody's seen the founding father in about 30 years. Founding mama, she died in some lab accident. So what happened with your fence? Nothing. The Finn frowned. Dropped it. We had to look at this fantastic tangle of powers of attorney the TAs have, and that was it. Jimmy must have gotten into Straylight, lifted the head, and then Tessier Ashpool sent their ninja after it. Smith decided to forget about it. Maybe he was smart. He looked at Molly. The Villa Straylight. Top of the spindle. Strictly private. So, here we introduce, obviously, our primary antagonists / the landscape in which the bulk of this book is going to take place, right? We're going to really be delving into what is presented here as a new kind of social structure, though a social structure that is emerging out of the rapacious capitalism of the 1980s, right? There's nothing here that is terribly unfamiliar to those of us who have studied the economic boom of the 1980s and exactly how influential families maintain their influence and power over the years. But there are some interesting wrinkles here, right? We're seeing the inclusion of this cryogenics technology, right? You can freeze someone, during which time they are legally dead, which also opens up a really fascinating new avenue of questioning regarding the mind-body duality problem. And then they can come back. Then we can defrost them. We can thaw them out, and they can return to their life, picking up again. How does, and this is one of the underlying questions of all of cyberpunk fiction, right? How does a stable society account for the growth in all of this, the rapid onset of brand new technologies? How does any society, in a time where technological innovation is occurring at such a swift pace, maintain any kind of stability, any kind of rule of law, any predictable and consistent boundary conditions around that society? And the answer is, of course, that ultimately you can't. Here we see this kind of the stratification of law and authority, right? On Earth, there are still, well, not laws perhaps as we would recognize them, or not laws as we would ideally recognize them in a utopian society. But there are still at least recognizable authorities. We see that during the panic at SenseNet, right? There are still forces of society that are levied against, excessive conditions. Above that, though, you have orbital law. You have the idea that once you get into space, laws are just much more relaxed, right? Nobody really cares about cloning. Nobody really cares about genetic modification. Nobody really cares about cryogenics. And by extension, as you go up and up and up, as you go further and further away, you eventually reach the Villa Straylight, which is strictly private, the tip of the spindle. Nobody knows what happens in there. And apparently, there's not enough law to stop Tessir Ashpool from sending a vat-grown ninja assassin all the way down to Earth to recover the head and to assassinate Jimmy for taking it in the first place. So this is our introduction, as I say, to the Villa Straylight, where we will spend the back half of this entire book, or around which we will spend the back half of this entire book. But here we conclude Chapter 5 with Case heading back home. He fires up Dixie Flatline, the construct, with some elementary recall, and then runs a hack in London as we transition out to Chapter 6, where Case hacks Bell Europa and finds immediately, and let me pause here just to observe how swiftly and confidently the deep mechanics of this book are moving. We introduce Wintermute, and everyone in this book is smart enough that we can basically identify what Wintermute is immediately, right? Case becomes suspicious of Armitage, partly at Molly's urging, and he basically immediately finds the proof of who Armitage is, or at least was, right? This is where we recover the footage of the post-war military trials focused on a Colonel Willis Corto, who of course turns out to be Armitage. It seems that Corto leads the Russian attack that was mentioned earlier, the deployment of the first real computer virus and the birth of Case's passion and profession here. And then we get this slide in the aftermath of what happened to Corto. There were gaps in the story here where Case scanned documents concerning the flight of a commandeered Russian gunship that managed to reach Finland, to be gutted as it landed down in a spruce grove by an antique 20mm cannon manned by a cadre of reservists on dawn alert. Screaming Fist had ended for Corto on the outskirts of Helsinki, with Finnish paramedics sawing him out of the twisted belly of the helicopter. The war ended 9 days later, and Corto was shipped to a military facility in Utah, blind, legless, and missing most of his jaw. It took 11 months for the congressional aide to find him there. He listened to the sound of tubes draining. In Washington and McLean, the show trials were already underway. The Pentagon and the CIA were being balkanized, partially dismantled, and a congressional investigation had focused on Screaming Fist, ripe for watergating, the aide told Corto. He'd need eyes, legs, and extensive cosmetic work, the aide said, but that could be arranged. New plumbing, the man added, squeezing Corto's shoulder through the sweat-damp sheet. Corto heard the soft, relentless dripping. He said he preferred to testify as he was. No, the aide explained. The trials were being televised. The trials needed to reach the voter. The aide coughed politely. Furthering our discussion of the commodification of body and being, right? Here, Corto has been turned into a weapon, and then in the aftermath of, in the sense that he is engaged in a military operation, which is of dubious legality, even under these complex circumstances, he is then, blown out of the sky in this stolen Russian gunship. We heard part of this story before, as you'll recall. And then in his absolutely physically ruined state, he winds up being recruited into a bit of political theater. He's recruited to testify. And in order to testify, of course, he cannot look like someone who has suffered the wounds, the terrible, terrible wounds that he has in fact suffered, but he needs to be photogenic. He needs to be the appearance of the thing rather than the substance of the thing. And hey, isn't that just another perspective on being and body, the physical distinction between what you are and what you present yourself to be, and how what you present yourself to be is oftentimes a product of mind as much as body. More on that too as we move forward through this book. We learn here that Corto's role in the trials contributes to the protection of those who contributed to the electromagnetic pulse weapons in Russia in the first place, right? So the irony that Corto is being wheeled out, he has been physically rebuilt and then he is wheeled out in front of television cameras in order to protect those people who are responsible for him being where he was in the first place. And then he is thrown aside. He becomes an uncomfortable reminder of a thing that politically it would be more beneficial to forget. So he is dismissed and he brutally kills the congressional aide with his bare hands and goes on the run to Europe and to North Africa and to Singapore and to Thailand and then ultimately back to the US. He is diagnosed with schizophrenia and is then taken to a hospital in Paris that tries to cure him with cybernetics, and it works with a gigantic asterisk. More on that, because again, right, our characters are smart. We're gonna return to this immediately. So from there, I promised that we would talk a little more about industrialization and post-industrialization. And here, as we are leaving Europe, we're not yet in Europe, as we are leaving the sprawl for Istanbul, we get this brief beat. Just thinking out loud, how smart's an AI case? Depends. Some aren't much smarter than dogs. Pets cost a fortune anyway. The real smart ones are as smart as the Turing heat is willing to let them get out. I'm realizing now, I think that I have skipped a slide here. Do I have the original slide that I had? Do I have the original slide that I wanted? I don't, it would seem. Oh no. Okay, well, never mind. I will improvise off of this, because what I was going to talk about was the landscape of the sprawl as it's presented to us, right? As Case is going to the airport, we get this description of this post-industrial landscape, the ruins of old machinery littering the landscape around him. And while that ties back to our initial discussion of the sprawl right at the beginning of tonight's session, it also connects us to, well, the reminder that the future is always built on the bones of the past, right? We never get a fresh slate. We never get a tabula rasa. We never get a real chance to start over. We're always revising the mistakes of the past into the mistakes of the future. And that is, of course, particularly relevant to Gibson. This post-industrialism argument is immediately relevant to Gibson. Of course, as he's writing this in the early 1980s, we're seeing the first real decline and fall of the American automotive industry in Michigan, particularly in Detroit, after the oil booms and the oil panics of the very late 1970s. So obviously that's relevant here. We're seeing what happens after industry is gone from these places. But of course, we must also remember that Gibson grows up. He spends a large part of his life in Virginia, in Appalachia. So he has seen the ruinous industrial collapse from, the boomtown where he grew up really did explode in population in the 1940s and then stagnated as the coal industry in that particular part of the country basically went away, right? Not as decisively as it would later, not as decisively as it did in other parts of Appalachia, but it saw a steady decline through the 60s and 70s. So there's little doubt in my mind that Gibson is very familiar with the physical landscapes of the post-industrial world. In that case, of course, it's the world that has been left behind, right? The tide of industry has rolled out and left these rusting hulks behind. What he's envisioning here partly is what happens after that, right? What replaces not just these specific industries in these specific locales. Of course, unfortunately, in those specific instances, nothing replaced those industries, and many parts of the country that were industrialized, heavily industrialized in the middle of the 20th century, many places that were heavily industrialized in the wake of the Second World War, or even during the Second World War in certain aspects, they are now just impoverished and remain so. Growing up in Scotland, it was, you could tell which places had industries that had departed, right? If you go to Glasgow, then you can see it. If you go to Dundee, you can see it. If you go to the fishing villages along the Murray Firth, where I grew up, you can see entire villages that were supported by a particular industry, and that industry went away. And the towns never recovered. They're holding on as best they can. And perhaps one day there will be something post-industrial that can take root in those places, that can revitalize. Gibson seems to suggest that is the case with his seemingly underlying notion that his bias toward, if you like, this kind of circular repeating patterns of history. Anyway, all of that was to say that we get to Istanbul. That is our next beat. We meet the Finn at the hotel. We're introduced to the Armenian contact, who Case rather ignorantly nicknames Jersey. We are here on the trail of Peter Riviera, who Molly mentioned previously. He's going to be this sociopathic thief who is stuffed full of cybernetics that can make his victim see whatever he wants them to see. He is apparently going to be the last part of our crew to take down. Well, we'll see what we take down as we get there, as we get into orbit and get to the Villa Straylight. We get that gross scene with Riviera where he, manifests a monster erupting from his body. Molly takes him down. And I'll pause here to note that there is, many readers have noticed a kind of bias operating here in Istanbul. I think there are a lot of people who don't care for the Istanbul section of this book, and I don't particularly care for the Istanbul section of this book because it feels as though we are moving through something that is just more mean-spirited and less developed than any of the other locales that we're going to spend time in. And it is tempting, I think, to maybe consider this a product of an Occidental bias, right? A kind of racism against, the East, right? A kind of Orientalism almost here in the way that we are depicting Istanbul, in the way that we are depicting Turkey. But I think that if you strip that back and you look at how we are depicting Turkey in the pages of this book versus the ways in which we're depicting Japan in this book, we're seeing instead a division here, a bias against Turkey, not because it is in the Near East or not because it is a non-Anglophonic, Western European rooted culture, but because it is old, because it is the oldest, right? Turkey is the ancient world. It is emblematic of the ancient world in a way that the sprawl obviously isn't, and Chiba City obviously isn't. And I think that perhaps is the underlying prejudice that's operative in this part of the book, which still nonetheless generates a kind of friction in a way that I don't really enjoy. I don't, not my favorite part of this book. We do also get the odd beat here, that horses are extinct in this world. We do not take the time to clarify if the United States of America exists. Nope. The sprawl, yes, but the USA as a operative political unit, we get no clue. We just don't know if that's true. But Gibson does take the time to tell us that horses are extinct, and even the devotions, the dedication of Arab breeders to try and Jurassic Park horses, those attempts are so far futile. So at this point, Case tells Molly the Armitage story that he learned in the last chapter, and then Molly asks him about Wintermute, and then we get to the slide that I did actually pull for tonight's session. There's something about doing the show on a Friday that just does not fit. Feeling like I'm kind of on the ragged edge of keeping control of this session. Just thinking out loud, how smart's an AI, Case? Depends. Some aren't much smarter than dogs, pets, cost a fortune anyway. The real smart ones are as smart as the cheering heat's willing to let them get. Look, you're a cowboy. How come you aren't just flat out fascinated with these things? Well, he said, for starts, they're rare. Most of them are military, the bright ones, and we can't crack the ice. That's where all the ice comes from, And then there's the touring cops, and that's bad heat. He looked at her. I don't know. It just isn't part of the trip. Jockey's all the same, she said. No imagination. They came to a broad rectangular pond where carp nuzzled the stems of some white aquatic flower. She kicked a loose pebble in and watched the ripples spread. That's Wintermute, she said. This deal's real big, looks to me. We're out here where the little waves are too broad. We can't see the rock that hit the center. We know something's there, but not why. I want to know why. I want you to go and talk to Wintermute. I couldn't get near it, he said. You're dreaming. I am fairly fascinated, I have to say, by the positioning of AI in the world that Gibson imagines, and counterpointing that with the general reliance on celebration of fascination with obsession with computer technology, right? Because what Molly is presenting here, I think, is kind of a compelling argument that, look, you're obsessed with computers. Isn't AI the end point of computers? Isn't it ultimately what all of this is for? Aren't we just ultimately rushing toward it? Isn't AI fundamentally kind of just an evolution of exactly the kind of processing capability that we've seen Case wield already. You know, when he asks his deck for the précis about the Panther Moderns, for example, when he asks his deck to go through the video, all of the trial footage and compile this story of what exactly happened to Armitage, isn't that kind of just a prototype of what AI could eventually be? And Case says no, because mind is different, right? If there were such a thing as real artificial intelligence, and to be clear, in the real world, there is not, and may in fact never be. We don't know the mechanisms that underlie it. We can create something that can. I should have done more work here on Turing to kind of lay out something more clearly explanatory about all of this reliance on Turing terminology here. Alan Turing coins the Turing test and comes up with the idea that a computer is sufficiently intelligent that we might refer to it as an artificial intelligence if and only if it can maintain a conversation with a human being and that human being does not know or cannot be certain that the computer is artificial, right? Which is a really helpful kind of descriptive analysis of what artificial intelligence is, but doesn't address, almost deliberately fails to address any real underlying questions about the nature of intelligence, the nature of mind, the nature of being, the nature of personhood and personality, right? The Turing test doesn't tell us if something is intelligent. It tells us if a system, an algorithmic system, can process enough information to respond convincingly in a very narrow pattern. Which, you know, it can. We can, well, I was going to say we can do that now. We can't really do that now, at least not reliably, at least not convincingly. But we can, you know, fabricate through the use of large language models. We can fabricate these kinds of responses. Are we ever going to move past that to genuine artificial intelligence, right? This is the extension of Molly's argument here. Surely artificial intelligence is the apotheosis of everything that is computer. Well, we can think about that within the bounds of Gibson's book, and we can think about that within the bounds of reality. And the answer is that we don't know. We don't know if there is some additional factor. We don't know if there is some quantum leap. We don't know if just increasing sophistication and complexity is enough, right? We just haven't yet answered that information. But Case, or answered that question, excuse me. But Case seems to be very clear that in fact the answer is no. He's not interested. That is not why he likes computers. It's not why he likes cyberspace. It's not why he does what he does. It's not what he is, in fact, right? And I find that endlessly fascinating, because there is something about the use of the tool. There is something about 20th century, the march of 20th century progress in particular. And I suppose this really has its roots in the Enlightenment, right? But there is the idea that we are moving toward this final fixed state, that tools can be improved until we are now further down the productive road, that we are further down the sequence of creation, sequence of events of creation, right? If you are an artist, you get better and better tools, such that the art that you create takes less time, that it is more efficient, that it is better quality. But there is a thrill from the tools that you have. There is something to be said for stripping out some of that belief in higher tiers of engagement, in higher orders of being, right? I think that there is something to be said for cutting back from that and engaging in the thing that is in front of you, which, yes, for Case is a virtual environment within a computer, kind of still a science fiction concept for us, but is at least accessible to him. It is kind of, you know, he's a rock star criminal, but that's what it is. He's not pushing the frontier of understanding and being. Okay, let's conclude this with our last slide of this evening here, as I am approaching time. We're going to return, of course, to Wintermute. Before we get to that, we spent some time with Riviera. I haven't pulled any of the slides from Riviera because they're frankly just gross. So we learned that Riviera is the absolute worst. And then with the same abrupt instruction that carries us from the sprawl to Istanbul in the first place, we learned that we are now leaving Istanbul behind and we are getting on the shuttle heading for Freeside. Case goes off to buy some cigarettes, hoping insanely, hello, early 1980s, that there is a smoking section on the shuttle. And then we get one of the scenes that I just think defines this book. It is one of the creepiest scenes in the entire book, and I love it very much. We're going to take a look at it right now. He fumbled through a pocket full of Larasi, slotting the small, dull alloy coins one after another, vaguely amused by the anachronism of the process. The phone nearest him rang. Automatically, he picked it up. Yeah? Faint harmonics, tiny, inaudible voices rattling across some orbital link, and then a sound like wind. Hello, Case. A 50 Lirasi coin fell from his hand, bounced, and rolled out of sight across Hilton carpeting. Wintermute, Case. It's time we talk. It was a chip voice. Don't you want to talk, Case? He hung up. On his way back to the lobby, his cigarettes forgotten, he had to walk the length of the ranked phones. Each rang in turn, but only once as he passed. I just love it. And this is, of course, so much more provocative in the early 1980s than it is now. Now we can kind of encapsulate, we can conceive of the possibility of an AI behaving like this, not least of all, of course, because we've seen things like Wintermute do things like this in movies. If you're, a fan of Mission Impossible, for example, we've seen things like this happen. The idea of the surveillance state has become now much more prevalent, much more functional, much more operative, much more present for us in our daily experience. But there is something specific here about the unhurried nature of Wintermute, about the ability of Wintermute to reach out into the real world. That is a huge... even the idea, right? The reason that he notes it's a chip voice, the idea that Wintermute can talk is technologically provocative when Gibson is writing this book. Now, it's commonplace, of course. Siri can talk to you through your phone at any point. I probably just activated my phone by saying the name of the infernal beast right there and then. But that, is a thing that is familiar to us, but still would have been shocking. All the same, I don't think that this scene has lost any of its efficacy, because we are now much more familiar with the kind of technology that Gibson is largely envisioning here at this point in the book. I'll note here, Lirasi, Turkish lira, issued by the Central Bank of the Republic of Turkey today. 1 lira is worth about 2.5 US cents, or about 2 euro cents. The history of the lira is fascinating. If you want to learn some just crazy stories from the world of economics, let me tell you about the Turkish lira. So, that is going to do it. Brian has dropped a very interesting question here in the chat. I'm going to get to that in just 1 second, Brian. Before we do, I want to call this out here and show you our schedule for the next couple of weeks. As I say, next week, December 11th, we're going to be back onto our regular Thursday night slot because, Fridays feel bad. I don't know what's happening here at all. Next Thursday night, December 11th, Neuromancer Part 3, Midnight in the Rue Jules Verne. That is a really great read. I'm looking forward to discussing that with you. And then December 18th, in order to finish this book and leave us a little room to begin The Voyage of the Dawn Treader at the end of December, we're going to take an extra length session and just finish up the Straylight run. We're going to read that whole chunk, the whole back half of the book in one evening. And I think that's going to be okay, because for all that it is pretty compelling and for all that we get new and interesting ideas, for all that we get challenging ideas as we move through that part of the book, a lot of them are kind of isolated, and if they connect out to the wider world, do so on the backs of ideas that we've already discussed, of ideas that we've already established. The tension between the body and the mind, the sense of being an identity in a world where such things are mutable, if not outright fungible, the idea of oligarchical power, of economic power, how we isolate and how we remain interdependent. All of these topics we've kind of established already. Many of those we've discussed tonight. So we're going to, I think, be able to move pretty quickly through that, but it will probably be a full old school 2-hour session. It's going to be back when we were discussing the Silmarillion. We're going to be here for a while that night, but I think it will be a lot of fun. And then right now, because Christmas Day falls on a Thursday this year, and I think that that's probably a bad idea to try and do a live show then, I will find sometime around the 28th, 29th, 30th, somewhere around there to do a live show and begin our first reading of C.S. Lewis's The Voyage of the Dawn Treader, the third Narnia book. I'm anticipating 3 weeks for that. I think that should be a fairly straightforward read to get through that. So that's our discussion of Neuromancer for tonight, but let me take a look at this question. This is fascinating from Brian. I'm just going to quote Brian directly here, and we'll see what we can do with it. Revisiting a topic covered in the Part 1 episode, the barrage of Gibson's technical jargon and concepts, as well as people, places, and events, reminded me of the storytelling technique for including textual ruins throughout the text for the purpose of world building. Textual ruin is a concept coined by, I think, the Prancing Pony podcast. I believe that you are right. In fact, I believe that it is the Prancing Pony podcast that coined that term, where Tolkien would make regular references to historical people, places, or events without ever providing additional information or context. I may be wrong because I barreled through the audiobook, but I don't think everything coming from the world building fire hose is addressed later on in the text. It absolutely is not, Brian. You're completely correct there. You're right. So what the guys from PPP refer to as textual ruins, right? These literally, right? The ruin. I think it's from the beginning of The Hobbit. As we're heading toward Rivendell, we can see the ruins of ancient castles up there on the hillside, right? Kind of silhouetted against the sky. These are things that Tolkien introduces, partly because they are products of his own working, his own legendarium, partly because he has this developed sense of the history of the place and wants to honor that, even if there's no space for it in this story that he's actually writing at that moment, which is often the case. But also, yes, Tolkien refers to it as, the illusion of depth, the idea that other stories have happened in this place, and it gives a richness, a complexity to the world. Gibson, you're completely right, throws out innumerable concepts, names, ideas, provocative details that we then never return to. What makes it hard, what makes readers struggle with Gibson, particularly the beginning of Neuromancer, is, as you say, it is unclear what you are supposed to care about and what you are not supposed to care about, right? Are you supposed to give a damn about this particular detail that will be significant in 3 pages? The problem is that you have to hold it in your head for those 3 pages. You have to kind of just you can't just let all of it wash over you. You have to try and maintain a presence in the text such that when he does return to it, when Case then talks to Molly about it, or we get just a paragraph of authorial voice telling us the backstory of this particular incident, you need to still have the referent there so that you can understand the connection that he's drawing. It is challenging. Neuromancer is absolutely a book. I think the first time I read it, I maybe got 30% of it. And I was, young. I was in my teenage years, my early teenage years, the first time that I read Neuromancer. But I remember the experience of coming back to it after a couple of years and really loving it, right? The things that stand out still stood out. The book worked at like a very basic level, but it was a few years later when I came back and understood so much more of what was going on, because when a concept is introduced, you can glom onto it. You can connect it immediately to the parts of the explanation that you remember later. And each reading, I think, as I say, right, I wasn't thinking about this idea of Aristotelian identity in terms of Neuromancer until this reading, and this is perhaps my 5th or 6th reading of Neuromancer, over the course of 30-some years. That's, long gaps in between, but still, it's a book that I find that you can return to partly because of that world building. And the problem is that it does do what Tolkien's commitment to the illusion of depth does, right? It does do what textual ruins do, which is it gives you a sense impression of a world that is incredibly complex, of a world that is fast moving, of a world that is directly challenging, right? And we're also balancing all of this stuff as we're introduced to, right, at Chiba City at the beginning, right? We get this idea that if you move too slow, you sink below the surface of the water, but if you move too fast, you disrupt the surface tension and something will get you. Either you will sink, and that's maybe the best thing that could happen to you, or some predator will identify you. So you will become prey. So there's this balance, even as the detail, as the fire hose, as you say, Brian, is being turned on the reader. There is this idea that you have to keep up with it, but not too much. You have to stay agile in this world as it's being presented to you, which is phenomenal. It's just great. Like Gibson can turn a phrase. His short story work in particular, if you're enjoying the sentence by sentence construction of Neuromancer, I can highly recommend the what is it collected under? Burning Chrome is the short story collection, which includes, as I say, many of those stories, including Johnny Mnemonic, including Burning Chrome, including Fragments of a Hologram Rose, are canonical or pseudo-canonical to the events of Neuromancer. And you can go and really enjoy that book because many of those short stories are just impeccably crafted, just beautiful things. But there is a problem. It becomes... I was talking about this just the other day. I was thinking about the... I believe I talked about this back in our 2nd unit, where we talked about the Terry Miles book Rabbits. And I was talking about ergodic texts. I was talking about the work of scholar Espen Arseth, I believe in his book Cybertext, which is primarily about games and game systems, but still clearly has a lot of applicability to some of the modern ways in which we approach stories and storytelling. And his idea is that we can conceal the story itself, the text itself, through some kind of obfuscatory practice, right? Whether it is, we're literally encoding it, right? We're literally using a cipher to change the letters on the page, and then the reader has to solve the cipher in order to get to the story. Normally, as we read, stories or prose itself is transparent, right? You read the text, and if you are, out of middle school, then reading is a fairly transparent process. You just read the text and the things happen in your brain that are supposed to happen in your brain. You're not consciously aware of looking at the next word and parsing it. And I know I'm being somewhat ableist there, and I'm being, I know that there are people out there with challenges, but in general, that is how text is positioned. That is the intentionality of text. You generally aren't taking a book off the shelf at the Barnes & Noble and opening it up and seeing something that is challenging to physically read and internalize. But ergodic texts do that. Ergodic texts are obfuscated in some way. Terry Miles does this with different codes. I've got behind me the book that J.J. Abrams co-wrote that is full of footnotes and codes, right? The work of David Foster Wallace would be considered a kind of ergodic text because it's just hard to get to the point of the piece. Hugh is leaving us. Good night, Hugh. Hugh has a flight home from Canada in the morning. Take care on your flight, Hugh, and Godspeed as you make it all the way back across to South Africa. I hope you'll be able to join us next week. Just to conclude this thought, Brian, see, you sent me down this long track here. The product of Gibson's fire hose of detail, as you put it, Brian, is ergodic. It is obfuscatory. It is a thing that can stand between the reader and the meaning of the text. Now, I think it is too straightforward, perhaps too facile to argue that is just a bad thing, right? Or, hey, be a better writer. Be more clear in what you're doing, because there is a value to this huge rush of detail, to this overwhelming rush of detail, and to the way that Gibson plays with science fiction and also, contemporary 1980s punk culture and commercialism and the idea of the kind of neo-libertarian free market that is so much a part of 1980s, hegemonic American culture, right? There are real values that emerge, or there are valuable things that emerge from his approach here. But yeah, it's part of the problem, is that you get the illusion of depth, but you also get that obfuscatory impulse, that barrier to reading and to full comprehension, which I will say too is a component of Professor Tolkien's work as well, right? There are people who drop out of the Silmarillion because they get to the Valaquenta, and I'm like, no, I'm done, or they get to the realms of Beleriand, and they're just out for reasons which I completely understand. Obviously, almost the paradigmatic example is the Council of Elrond, where you're getting depth, real depth, also the illusion of depth, but real substance there, and it is simply too much for some readers, particularly their first time through that book. So you trade off, right? The idea that the world is complex and fully realized is in a tug of war with the transparency of the prose on the page and the ability of the reader to enter directly into your story. And where you position your text on that spectrum, I think, is going to speak to your genre, absolutely, to your purpose, to your themes, and also to your style as an individual writer, right? There's nothing necessarily about the work of David Foster Wallace that demanded this kind of impenetrable aspect, but that was his personal style, and it's difficult to kind of counteract that or to counter-argue that. I think also of, writers like Umberto Eco, who is enormously challenging. I mean, an incredible writer, but also sometimes a little difficult to parse directly on the page. I'm thinking of Foucault's Pendulum in particular there, right? I've got behind me here the Mark Danielewski House of Leaves, which, much like Foster Wallace, is kind of physically obfuscatory. It's physically difficult to read. It's physically difficult to handle all of the gigantic footnotes, and the way that it gets conceptual in its literal presentation of the text on the page is another means by which we can start to really stress the ways in which the story is entering into the reader's imaginary. Brian saying the 40% that I missed this time will be there to absorb in subsequent readings. Absolutely. Or you'll know when you get to it that actually this is never anything. I don't need to think about this. I don't need to worry about it. Yeah. All right. I think that's going to do it. Great question, Brian. Thank you so much for that. That was fantastic. That is going to do it. We will be back next week, next Thursday night, December 11th, in order to talk about part 3, Midnight in the Rue Jules Verne. So good. It's just going to be such a fun discussion. And then we'll close up the following week too. That is going to do it. Thank you to Brian. Thank you to the departed Hugh. Thank you to everyone else who is joining me live here tonight. I will talk to you all again very soon. Until then, please do take care. Good night, all.